Okay.
All right, well then the whole world is going to hear the rest of this. The Lutheran Study Bible at that time, what they did is they took essentially the NIV Study Bible, which was done by a number of various evangelical groups. We were participants in that, but it was a multi-denominational study Bible. We sort of took that and then edited some, added some things, took some things out. And if you look at your study Bible, you will see that some of the notes will have a little, not asterisk, but a little cross or something like that. And that is indicating insertions or additions that the Lutheran editors thought were particularly important. That study Bible, as well as the NIV, was sort of a transitional Bible that we were using. I think it was in 2005 or so with the advent. Well, we started using the English Standard Version. When the new hymnal came out, it was based on the English Standard Version. And the new Lutheran Study Bible, which is what you see there, is based on the Eastern, that's the ESV, the English Standard Version, and all notes were done by Lutheran scholars. So that you're no longer trying to take a study Bible that was designed for other purposes and sort of make it fit for us. That just the whole thing was done from start to finish with Lutheran sensibilities and understandings of Scripture. So you have a lot of citations, for example, in that study Bible to the Book of Concord, to various things that Luther or other Lutherans said, as well as a lot more quotations and citations of the early church fathers, which you didn't have in the NIV.
Maybe more insight than the other one.
Yeah, it's an improvement. The other was kind of a stopgap. They needed to do something and fairly quickly, and they just weren't able to do the entire thing from start to finish. So they adapted an earlier version, sort of an evangelical version, and adapted it for Lutheran purposes. So this is a superior one. It should be around for a while. People might wonder, I got this other one, and then 15 years later we got new translation and everything. Are we going to do this every 15 years? And the answer is, boy, I hope not. Okay, well, north and south, and of course everybody right away wants to get out the blue and gray and start thinking about this. This is a different north and south I want to talk about. Our Old Testament lessons from Amos. And then we also have our gospel lesson is concerning John and his run-in with Herod. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of an underlying issue that runs through the Old Testament, particularly the latter half of the Old Testament, and how it relates to even our church today. And this begins with, it doesn't begin here, but where our story is going to begin is the split between the north and the south. We have a period of time in Israel's history called the United Kingdom. Under Saul, it wasn't really terribly united, but there was only one king. And under David, it truly became a united kingdom eventually, although when David first began to be king, he only actually ruled over the southern part, and he slowly got sort of gained the confidence and the allegiance of the additional of the tribes. So eventually, David became king over all Israel. But he came from Judah, and his original sort of political support base was in Jerusalem. This is kind of important. His son Solomon inherited what David gave him, which was a united rule over all 12 tribes, and with sort of the headquarters in Jerusalem. And Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem became the central place for worship in all of Israel. Now, as will tickle some of your hearts, Solomon was too heavy on the taxes, and we learned that this caused lots of problems. And so for us today, sometimes we say, yeah, the same thing is going to happen today. Too many taxes, and we need to be careful. Well, actually, Solomon had a very heavy hand and had kind of a tin ear to the people. But during his lifetime, all 12 tribes maintained their allegiance to Solomon and the house of David. When we call the house of David, what I mean is David and his descendants. Okay? Just like when you think of British royalty, you can think of the House of Windsor, the House of Tudor, something like that. These are not. It's not just since you have a dynasty where the descendants inherit the throne. A single family will remain in control of a monarchy, for example, until there's an overthrow. Okay, now David and Solomon. David begat a dynasty, and Solomon was the second, and Rehoboam was the third. And Rehoboam took Solomon's sort of tenure and took it to the next level. And essentially, what happened is during Rehoboam's reign, the northern 10 tribes split from Judah. I'm going to read to you from 1 Kings chapter 12, beginning at verse 25. I'm going to read a little bit, his comment, so that you can kind of see the theological basis for what is going to go forward. It says here, then Jeroboam led a revolt against Rehoboam. So now we have Rehoboam, which continues to be in the house of David, and Judah continues their allegiance to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, the son of David. Okay, Jeroboam leads a rebellion, and the northern tribes give their allegiance to Jeroboam and not Rehoboam. So now you have a split between the north and the south. Okay. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. So Ephraim is part of one of the northern tribes. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. Now, the reason he was worried about this is because the religious center of Israel continued to be in Jerusalem, which was in Judah, which was the tribe that maintained its allegiance to David. So he's thinking to himself, how can I maintain my country and the allegiance of the 10 northern tribes if the center of worship continues to be in Jerusalem? So he said, if this people go up and offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So he's just realizing the political impossibility of continuing their allegiance to the Jerusalem temple, while at the same time trying to maintain a political distance from the house of David. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel. What does that sound like?
Idolatry.
Well, it sounds like idolatry, but what particularly? What is it? Behold your gods. Do you remember when Moses went up on the mountain, and when he was down, Aaron made a what? Golden calf, and he said, behold your God. Now, I want you to understand what this is, because it's important to realize what we're really talking about here. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now, did a golden calf bring the people out of the land of Egypt? Well, where did the golden calf come from? I mean, did they just hatch that out of their head? Well, and more specifically, it was Egyptian. The Egyptians worshipped calves and cows, things like that. And that's why the people hadn't been out of Egypt very long when Aaron had the idea of the golden calf. Now, when Aaron said, here's your God, this golden calf, did he really believe that the people were just going to right away start worshiping the gods of Egypt? He didn't. He wasn't doing that either. What he was doing is that the people had been, remember, in Egypt for 400 years. And it was in Egypt that they learned an awful lot about how worship is done. And they learned how worship was done from Egyptians, okay? The things that Moses had taught them were only relatively recent, and now Moses is up on the mountain, and we don't know what's become of him. That's what they're saying. So the golden calf was not, hey, you know, we know the God that smote the Egyptians, but that's so ancient history now. Let's get a new and shiny God. That's not what Aaron was doing. What he's saying is, we know the God who brought us out of Egypt. Now let's worship him properly, the way we know how to worship, and that's what we learned from Egypt, because, you know, the Egyptians were much more cosmopolitan and sophisticated than we are, and Moses taught us other things, but Moses is gone and we don't know where he's at. So we are going to worship the God who brought us out of Egypt, but we're going to use worship forms that we have learned and become familiar with in Egypt, okay? Now, that's what Jeroboam was doing here. He's not just hatching out of his head a brand new religion. Hey, we can't continue to have this old religion. That's going to get us, that's going to ruin my kingdom. Let's have a new religion up here and everybody follows him. That's not what he did. What he did is, he said, we can't continue worshiping down there in Jerusalem. We're going to worship the same God as they're worshiping down there, but we're going to worship him in our own way. And we're going to use Canaanite and Egyptian methods of worship rather than adopt wholeheartedly what's going on in Jerusalem, and that's necessary from a political point of view. From a political point of view, if we keep going down to Jerusalem, these people are not going to stay with me. They're going to gravitate back down to the house, and we can't have that from a political point of view. So we've got to have a distinct set of worship up here, and it's got to look a little different. So what he's doing is he's probably characterizing this as not just a brand new religion, but as sort of a reformation and an innovation and a return to tradition. Who knows what he did, okay, what was his mind, but he had a political objective. We have to maintain our cohesiveness with these 10 tribes. We can't be dependent upon the South, or this won't work, we won't last, okay? So what he's doing is perfectly understandable from a purely political and sociological point of view. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So he's identifying what we're worshiping here in these calves with the God who brought him out of Egypt. He's not saying, forget that God, let's worship this thing. He's saying, this God that brought us out of the land of Egypt is now to be worshipped in this way, okay? The ancient pagans were much more sophisticated than we give them credit for. That doesn't mean that they were right, but you know, they had certain ideas that gods aren't exactly the same as the stone thing that we're worshiping, but they did have the idea that somehow or another you gain some control or access to the gods through these stone things. And in many ways, the pagan religion was very primitive, but in other ways, it was not so very primitive, and these people did think about what they were doing, and they weren't that naive all the time. So we should read into this a little bit more sophistication than it looks like. Like he just sets up a golden calf and said, worship this, and they say, oh, well, sure, whatever. You know, that's probably not how it went. So this is what he did. And he set one up, so he had two calves. He set one up in Bethel. Bethel is north in Ephraim. Ephraim was the largest of the 10 tribes. So oftentimes the 10 tribes would be referred to as Ephraim, even though just like the southern tribes would be referred to as Judah. There were actually not just Judah, but Judah and Benjamin was there too. But so he sets one up in Bethel, which is not that far north of Judah, and the other in Dan. Dan's way up north, okay, because he realizes that we can't expect people way up there in the north to keep coming down here to Bethel. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up one sanctuary up in Dan and the other sanctuary here in Bethel. And these became two focal points. And so whereas in the south they had one sanctuary, and that was in Jerusalem, in the north they had two sanctuaries, one in Bethel and one in Dan. Then the comment in 1 Kings, it says, then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one, the sin. The golden calf and the worship that was happening there in these shrines, not sacristies, temples, sanctuaries. This was a sin, and the people were going all the way to Dan in order to sin. He also made temples on high places. Now, what are high places? This is a little bit much. It literally is a hilltop or mountaintop or anything that just kind of rose above anything else. This is much more closely aligned with Canaanite religion. Canaanite is the general religion of the pagans in the area. And fairly typical of ancient Near Eastern pagan religion generally is that whenever you had a hilltop, and the higher the hill, the more holy the top was. The idea was it was closer to the gods. You can see this in like Mount Olympus and things like this. It's the same kind of an idea. So any hilltop was seen to be somewhat closer to the gods, and so these would become places where little sanctuaries would be set up, and they were called high places. Also, sometimes if you had a big plain with nothing on it, and like a big tree right in the middle of it or something like that, that big tree would be something that would sort of attract a sanctuary or a high place. So sometimes we'll hear about high places, and they would conduct their idolatrous worship on every high place and before every spreading tree and things like that. It's the way that the Hebrews would speak of the ugly worship of the Canaanites. Now, so he sets up a sanctuary in Bethel, one in Dan, and then sets up all these other high places. Again, what you have here is not just brand new religion. We'll just spring it out of our head and do however we want. What we're going to do is we're going to have a blend. It'll be a little of this and a little of that. So the Canaanites had some of this right. So let's use some of their wisdom, and we'll worship God who brought us out of Egypt, using some of the wisdom and the ways of the Canaanites, and we'll use some of the wisdom and the ways of the Egyptians, and we'll set up these various high places, and it will be different than what we have down in Jerusalem, where they do it their way, but we're going to do it our way. Okay. Later on, remember the story with Jesus and the woman, and it's at Mount Gerizim, and she said, the Jews say that you have to worship there, and we say you have to worship here. Well, in this mountain, Mount Gerizim was not far from Bethel. Okay, so you had that argument going then too. The Samaritans thought that God was to be worshipped on their sacred mountain and not in Jerusalem. This is a vestige of this idea that we have to maintain a religious separation in order to maintain a political separation. Now, that was Jeroboam's original thought. After so many generations go by, people are no longer thinking politically. Now they really think that they've got the right religion here. And so you're going to have this ongoing division between the way God is worshipped in the south and the way God is worshipped in the north. I'll read on a little bit. Let's see. He also made temples on the high places and appointed priests from among all the people who were not of the Levites. Remember, according to the law of Moses, all priests had to be drawn from the tribe of Levi. But the Levites maintained most of their allegiance to the southern tribe. So Jeroboam had to resort to expediency. We're going to have to find somebody else to do that. You be a priest. You be a priest. You be a priest. And that's what they did. And Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. He did it in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made, and he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he had made. He went up to the altar that he had made. Notice it says that he had made, that he had made, that he had made, in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month that he had devised from his own heart. And he instituted a feast for the people of Israel and went up to the altar to make offerings. Now, this becomes what's called the sin of Jeroboam. And we will return to this over and over. If you read 1 Kings really tells the story of what happened to the great reign of David. The great reign of David is recorded in 2 Samuel. 1 Kings begins with the reign of Solomon, but if you look at the reign of Solomon, you'll see that it is really just kind of the residual glow of David, and then a slow and steady demise. And then that decline turns into a split, and then we watch the northern and the southern kingdoms separately. And by the way, both the north and the south go south. They both decline. But the difference is the north declines on its own path and gets judged according to this sin of Jeroboam. The south has its own problems and it gets judged too. Okay? But you're going to hear over and over again, in the south, there is one dynasty. for the entire period of time in the south, it is the dynasty of the house of David. All of the kings over Judah were descendants of David. The house of David remained until it was finally overthrown in the exile. Okay? In the north, you had a number of different dynasties. You would have a king and he would be overthrown, and then you had a king and his son, and maybe a grandson, and he would be overthrown, and another dynasty would replace it, and so on. So in the north, you had a series of dynasties, one replacing the other. One of the biggest of the dynasties and most important was the dynasty of Omri, and Omri's son or grandson was Ahab, and you remember Ahab, and Jezebel and Elijah fought, the prophets of Baal, and the prophets of Baal were Canaanite prophets operating in the land. All right, so here's the key thing that you need to recognize. You didn't have the northern tribes just decide, we're not going to worship the God who brought us out of Egypt anymore. We're going to become Canaanites, or we're going to become Egyptians, or we're going to make up some brand new thing. What they did is they mixed and matched. Now, the word that we use for that theologically is syncretism. Syncretism means we're mixing a little of this and a little of that, and we're putting it together, okay? Can't remember what I got on here. How about that? Okay, so an awful lot of what we, isn't that lucky? I just happen to have that up there. Okay, let's put a few other things here so I don't forget. All right. This theme runs throughout the Old Testament prophets. People are naive when they think of the Old Testament prophets as just constantly railing against sin. They do constantly rail against sin. That's true. But people have a tendency to think of sin certain ways. They have a tendency to think of sin in terms of second table of the law sins, that we are stealing from one another, we are murdering one another, we are doing various things that we shouldn't, lying and all that kind of stuff. But it is primarily first table of the law problems that the prophets are railing against, okay? First table of the law, you are not fearing, loving, and trusting God with all your heart and more than anything else. You're not doing that. Syncretism falls into the category of first table of the law. You are not following God with your whole heart. You are calling upon other gods or using other worship forms. You are not keeping the Sabbath holy as he has commanded. And you get this battle between those who are wanting to intermix worship of other forms and other ways, whether it's other borrowed forms or whether it is, as we have here in some cases, just made up. Okay? And this becomes a very sinful idea in the preaching of the prophets. When you look at both the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, when you look at the minor prophets like Hosea and Amos and Obadiah and all of that, if you read those texts, you'll realize that overwhelmingly they are preaching against idolatry in its various forms. And they see synchronism as an aspect of idolatry. Okay? So if we were just, let's say, for example, if we were to decide that, Moses was right, and Muhammad is right, and Jesus is right, and maybe we even want to get more open-minded, and even Buddha is right, and maybe we can have up in the front here representations of all these different religions so that everybody can be happy, and we can open our door, we can have open minds and open hearts, and everybody can come in here and worship however they want. Now, and we could have a worship service that had a little bit from Islam and a little bit from Buddha and some Hinduism thrown in there, and a little Confucius pops up, and then we've got Moses and the Torah and Judaism, and then Jesus is there too. Maybe he's even there, kind of the glue holding it all together. But from the point of view of the prophets, that is flat idolatry. That is not just, well, you're trying to be inclusive. That's just idolatrous. It's one of the reasons why, by the way, the Missouri Synod has traditionally not been kind to Masonic lodges and things like that, because that's the kind of thing that they like to do. And so we get rather alarmed by that. I'm sorry, you wanted to ask a question.
In going through the Kings and Chronicles, they start out with this king, made him a king, and he ruled unpleasing to God.
Yes.
And another one, he ruled and he did pleasing to God. But he didn't destroy the high places. So how can we...
Okay, you have a distinction here, actually. If you were to separate out the northern kings, you will see that the taglines there are universally negative. He continued in the sin of Jeroboam, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did more evil even than his father did. As bad as his father was, he was even worse. His grandson was worse yet. So you will see that that is the universal judgment of God on the northern tribes. Now, on the south, you did not have universal evil kings. They were all of the house of David, but most of them were, in fact, not good kings. So most of the time the kings were judged, and one of the things that they were judged for was not getting rid of the high places. Okay? There were but here's an example of a good king. A good king, King Josiah. King Josiah went about reforming the temple and rebuilding the temple because it had fallen into disrepair, and he also sent folks out to destroy all the high places that were all over the place that his father and grandfather and so forth had left alone. So you will have that. You will have some of the kings that are judged good except for, and then you point out they didn't do this. Others would be judged good because they did this, but then their son rose up and he let the whole thing revert back. So when you read the history of kings, both in the north and the south, you see a steady decline. King Josiah is an exception. King Hezekiah is an exception. Hezekiah was not a perfect king, but he was considered generally to be a good king and faithful. So they were considered faithful if they walked in the ways of David their father, and if they didn't, then they were not faithful. But in every instance, you see that things are declining and declining and declining. And the words and the pronouncements of the prophets were, if you were preaching to the north, doom is coming your way. And doom did come to the north in 722 BC when Assyria conquered and destroyed the north, and the north from that time on was no longer a political entity. Okay? It existed, but it existed as a province of Assyria, and then a province of Babylon, and then a province of Persia, and so on. It didn't have independence after that. Amos is a prophet from the south sent to the north to preach against them. Okay, so bear that in mind when we get to the Old Testament lesson, that you are hearing about a prophet from the south preaching to the north. And you'll see that there are references to high places, there are references to sanctuaries. The high priest of Bethel, it talks about the high priest of Bethel, and Amos is preaching against all of these people. And his primary purpose is because of this sin of Jeroboam and this sort of synchronistic, partially idolatrous sort of worship. So the north was judged for that. The south was judged similarly. Isaiah was a prophet to the south, Jeremiah was a prophet to the south, Ezekiel was a prophet to the south, but if you read their preaching, you will see that their primary concern was idolatry. That is to say, not that in the south the temple had been raised and another temple built, but that the people themselves were continuing to worship other gods, continuing to establish high places, that there was corruption in high places, corruption in the temple itself, and things like that, and various ways in which sort of foreign worship ideas, things that did not flow from the law of Moses, were leaking in, and so the prophets preached very powerfully that this must stop, okay? But of course it didn't. So the south ended up being conquered first in 605 BC. So that was about 120 years after the north was destroyed. The south, there were a series of three. You hear about the exile, but it actually happened in, many phases, but three main phases. The first one was in 605, and they were conquered by the Babylonians. And sort of the rich and powerful movers and shakers of society were carted off to Babylon. It happened again in 597. There was a second wave, a second deportation, because the people were continuing to be agitating and causing problems and so on. So you had a puppet king left in Judah. The north was gone. You had a puppet king in Jerusalem, but the puppet king bowed his back, and so in come the Babylonians again, and in 586 they did business for good, and they sacked Jerusalem and burned the temple and carted off whatever remained of sort of the movers and shakers. Most people were not sent into exile. The problem is the people who were left there were all the people with no money and no skills, nothing really. So it was all the poor of the land that was left. And so for 70 years, the people were in exile. And this is the famous exile that we're talking about. There was no exile of the north. I mean, it was, but they never returned. In the south, the promise was, build homes, plant vineyards, and pray for the land in which you are being settled, because you're going to be there for a while. That was Jeremiah's words. And his prophecy was, after 70 years, you'll return. And after 70 years, the people did begin to return under the Persians, after the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians. You just got to get all these ancient empires in your head after a while, and it's important to know. The themes during this time, the themes during 1st and 2nd Kings, were all about the degradation of the societies. They continued to run after false gods and would not maintain a pure loyalty to the God who brought them out of Egypt. By the way, if you know anything about King David, you know that he was not an exemplar of moral purity. And yet he was called a man after my own heart. And where David is praised by God is in his absolute and unswerving loyalty to the Lord. So when you read his Psalms, you realize that this man, for all his faults, had an unswerving loyalty to the Lord, to Yahweh, the God who brought the people out of Egypt. So when the kings were praised, they were praised for having a similar devotion to Yahweh. And when they were condemned for failing to have that kind of a Davidic devotion. And then, of course, the idea of the Messiah would be the perfect David, okay? But that's for another day to talk about that. The exile became a time of purification. That's how the exile was seen. You're going to go away, an idolatrous people, and I'm going to bring you back purified. And so Ezra and Nehemiah, those books, and then also Malachi and Zechariah, are about the period of time after the people are brought back from exile. And they are about how we are going to reconstitute ourselves as the people of God and not repeat the mistakes of the past. So there were important questions about what do we do with Jews who have intermarried with Canaanites, okay? We can't have that. We have the establishment of, for the first time, of synagogues, what would become synagogues. This was sort of imported back from Babylon. Prior to the Babylonian exile, the center of worship was in Jerusalem. But remember, in 586, the temple was destroyed, so there was no temple to be the center of the worship, and the people were carted off in exile. So they developed synagogue worship, and the heart of synagogue worship, the heart of worship in the temple was the sacrificial system and the priesthood. That's been dismantled. While they were in Babylon, the heart of worship became the synagogue and the reading of the Torah, the Word of God. So when they come back, that continued, and eventually the temple was rebuilt. So at that point, you really had kind of two focal points for Judaism. One was the temple and the sacrificial system, which was reinstituted, but the other was this myriad of synagogues that were everywhere, and people were gathered around. You and I would recognize it as gathering around the Word of God, but that is not really how worship went. That was not the focus of worship pre-exile. So this was a new thing. And when you read Ezra and Nehemiah, you see a very, very strong focus on this time we're going to do it right. And we are not just going to follow the law, we are going to follow it to the letter. And so that's the whole focus of that section. You see there's really a transformation in what Judaism looked like. In fact, Judaism as a term usually is not employed to talk about the people of God prior to the exile. Judaism is usually what's referred to as what came out of the exile, and particularly what developed in the years after that. So, but this idea of purity, that is remaining purely devoted to Yahweh, the God who brought us out of Egypt, and that means worshiping him the way he said we should be worshiped, which means in Jerusalem and according to his word. That, as opposed to the various ways in which the world is going to want to update, change, or accommodate in various ways for various reasons why they would want to do things differently, okay? Now, we've talked a little bit about Jeremiah and exile, Daniel and return, and what that really meant. Next, the Persians were, as you know, well, maybe you don't, but anyway, the Persians eventually were conquered by none other than Alexander the Great, who not only conquered the Persians militarily, but he ended up conquering most of the known world at that time culturally. So there was this thing called Hellenism that developed following Alexander. And that basically was that Hellenism refers to anything Greek. So it's an adjective that refers to Greek culture, Greek language, Greek anything. And Greek things became the rage in the ancient world. Everything Greek. All architecture was Greek, people dressed Greek, the Greek language was spread far and wide, people read Greek poets and Greek plays and Greek philosophy, and this just became the rage everywhere. If you were anybody who was anybody, you were familiar with Greek culture. Well, this was the case also among the Jews, who were now, they had been conquered by the Persians, who had let them kind of run themselves and rebuild their temple. Now here come the Greeks, and now they're in charge. Okay, but culturally, this made for an interesting situation because a lot of the Jews were very enamored with things Greek, so that you ended up having kind of a split between those who were Hellenizers. We call them Hellenizers. They wanted to make Judaism more like Greek philosophy. They looked at Moses like a proto-Greek philosopher, and they wanted the temple to look like a Greek structure, and they wanted to do things in a Greek way. Morally, this was oftentimes a little problematic because the Greeks had somewhat looser morals than what. Then you had another, which was a reaction to that, and they were sort of the ultra-Orthodox kind of, I'm borrowing terms from later dates, but it's that idea. You had those who said, if it's Greek, we don't want it. Okay, we want to stay as far away from it as we can because it's poisonous, terrible. And then you had those who were in the middle, who would do a little of this and a little of that. It's the same then as it is today. You always have these kinds of things. But that was the sort of world that we came to in Jesus' day, that this had been percolating for several centuries at this point, this sort of tension between a Hellenistic tugging at the Hellenizing side of things and a pulling back for the more conservative sort, so that in Jesus' day you had on the one hand Sadducees, and Sadducees were very much more of a Hellenistic sort. They were the landed, wealthy people, they were the cultured people, and they tended to like things Greek, and they were also liked things stable, okay, because they were the ones that were sort of politically in charge. Then you had sort of the purists, the ones who wanted to return to, keep things pure and keep things the way they're supposed to be. We know these folks primarily as Pharisees, and the Pharisees were sort of separatists, and they wanted to make sure that we keep the law of Moses pure. The interesting thing is that Jesus had many very hot debates with the Pharisees, and not a whole lot with the Sadducees. And so actually, Jesus and the early Christians were much closer to the Pharisees than we were to the Sadducees. Now, we had some sharp divisions, obviously. But the Sadducees were a much more worldly sort and religiously much more willing to accommodate to the world, and Jesus just didn't have much to do with them. The Pharisees, where they went wrong in various ways, is they tended either to become very legalistic, or they would create rules, and the idea was to create rules that would act like as a fence around the real rule. God says don't work on the Sabbath day, okay. So we're going to have 5,000 rules to make sure that you don't do anything that's even close to work, okay? So you
Don't
walk
light a
one,
fire.
yeah, you can walk 1 mile and that's okay, but if you walk 5 miles, that's work. So now really 10 miles would probably be okay, but we're going to make it 1 mile. I'm making this up, but it's things like that that is exactly what they did. So the Pharisees were very legalistic, but they were legalistic because of a zeal to keep the law of Moses. It wasn't just that they were power hungry and just liked to control people. They were really trying to honor God by keeping the letter of the law and then some, to make sure that we don't accidentally transgress. So in some ways, the Pharisees were actually, very devoted to God and were worthy of a measure of respect. And we see that Paul was a Pharisee. How could he be anything else? But the truth of the matter is, Paul didn't just reject the Pharisees as being horrible people. He said that no, they're very devoted to the law, but they missed the point, okay? Because the law became for them the source of their life, and whereas Christ is the source of our life. Well, but you have this debate, and you see that also. There's another group that's even more extreme than the Pharisees. We call them the Essenes. They were so extreme that they were more like monks or something like that. They literally separated themselves from society because society was so hopelessly corrupt. You just can't live among those people and expect not to join them in their corruption. Similar themes to what you had before, just the names are changed and the circumstances are different, but you still have, on the one hand, people who are wanting to accommodate and make, let's not make Judaism too difficult. Let's make it a little bit more worldly, more like the Greeks. And on the other hand, you have, we're leaving town, we're going to live in caves, and we're going to hide our sacred documents that can be found 2,000 years later and become a great boon for archaeologists. And then you had the Pharisees who were in there fighting the good fight, but trying to fight the fight in order to keep Israel pure. Okay, and it's in the midst of this that Jesus comes. Now, so you see that. Who was ruling at that time? Well, it was the accommodationists, the Sadducees, but also on the political side, the Herodians. The Herodians were sort of puppets, first the Greeks and then the Romans, because they were cooperative. The way you become a puppet of an earthly empire is you accommodate and you do what the earthly empire wants. The Romans had no interest whatsoever in the religious tedium of the Jews. All they wanted was peace and pay your taxes. That's all they want. So if you're going to be a ruler with Augustus's or Tiberius's blessing, then you need to make sure that the land is peaceful, you're paying your taxes, and the best way to do that is to be accommodating to Roman ways and Roman things as much as possible. Okay? There's only so much you can do. These Pharisees are out there, they're causing their trouble. But, so the Herodians were worldly sorts who weren't terribly religious people. Now, that is the fellow that John is criticizing, because essentially Herod had taken his brother's wife. They had apparently divorced, and he took his wife. And Philip's still alive, so this is just plain adultery and contrary to the law of Moses. And here's Herod, one of the rulers. He was Jewish, quote unquote, but and he's one of their leaders. And right out in front of everybody, he's doing this. And so John felt compelled to point this out. And even though John was a very persuasive individual and had lots of people following him, and even Herod himself thought that this man had something to do with God, he made the mistake of getting the real power in the house upset, and that was his wife. Okay, so anyway, he ends up paying with his life. And in this way, there's sort of the connection between Amos, who is speaking to Amaziah, who is the high priest in Bethel, and Amaziah just basically throws him out and said, go back south and preach there, but don't come back up here again. And then you have Herod, who was, John was a thorn in his side, and he ends up paying with his life. This continues. You not only have Herod and John, but after the apostles, you have, to what extent should early Christians maintain their Jewish ways? Or to what extent really are we done with that? We're onto a new covenant, and so we are not bound by these things at all. The idea here was we need to accommodate to the Jews so that more of them will be comfortable becoming Christians. And so there was a wing, the sort of circumcision party is what it was called, among the Christians, who said, we really need to maintain our Jewishness so that we don't make it more difficult for Jews to come over and be Christians. And Paul was death on the circumcision party, the Judaizers he called them. No, they're very devoted in all of that, but they're wrong. And in Christ, none of these laws pertain, and so he wanted to make sure Christianity had its own way and did not sort of try to accommodate the Jews. Later on, there was the question of accommodating to other pagan religions and so forth. Gnosticism, in many ways, Gnosticism is an effort to sort of put a Christian dress on what were called mystery religions and things like that. They were pagan religions steeped in various kinds of pagan philosophy or visions or whatever, other religions. And we try to put a Christian gloss on it. Or in some ways, we take Christianity and we try to infuse it with some of this other stuff. Gnosticism was a real thorn in the flesh of the early church. Well, this actually continues on throughout the ages. The church has always had to try to figure out what balance that we have in trying to maintain proper church doctrine over and against the world in which we live, whatever it is. Now, that has not gone away today, not in the least bit. I've jumped many centuries, but we're really looking at the same kind of a thing today. When we talk about liberal churches, we're not just talking about churches that lack discipline. It's not just a matter of bad administration. We need to keep, tighter tabs on our folks, and we're just not. So, they're misbehaving, and we don't do anything about it. Liberal theology is an effort to try to import into the church's theology modern thinking. Now, it doesn't just sacrifice Christian theology to modern thinking, but it tries to integrate the two. A little bit like what I was talking about before, trying to integrate Canaanite and Egyptian forms of worship without getting rid of the true worship of the true God. So the effort is to say, okay, well, we believe in God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and Jesus, and all of that, but we need to make this more palatable to a modern mindset, and they try to adopt from modern philosophy and thinking as much as they think that they can get away with to make Christianity more palatable to modern minds. Okay, but this is more difficult to do than folks think, and what. Sometimes people will think, well, we'll just be more rational, and that's enough. And what they don't realize is what you've imported into the church are poison that is going to eat away at everything else. The sermon is going to get into that these two don't mix. They just can't mix. You can have one or you can have the other, but if you try to put them together, we're going to lose something very precious. When we think about how churches or why churches would adopt some of the positions that they have today, how can a church possibly decide that the most important thing that they should do is fight poverty? As important as that is, that's not the church's mission. And when some church says we're going to bless same-sex unions, and you say, where did they get that? I get asked that all the time. Where did they get this in the Scripture? Wow, I only wish I knew. Show me the passage. But that's not what happens. And what happens is you have an attempt to integrate thinking from the modern world, which is totally against the thinking of the kingdom, and you're trying to blend them together. And what ends up happening is you end up with a mishmash where it's neither one nor the other. And some very, very strange things happen. So when we talk about liberal theology, that's mostly what we're talking about. We're not talking about the traditional differences between a Lutheran and a Methodist and an Episcopalian. Okay, the traditional differences, you can outline what those are. When you talk about liberal theologies, that cuts across. We are much closer to a traditional Methodist than we would be to a liberal Lutheran, I guarantee you. A liberal Lutheran you'll hardly recognize as a Christian. A liberal Methodist and a liberal Lutheran go hand in hand, okay? And because it cuts across denominational lines, because it's something else. It's not a rereading of the Scripture because we found something in there that we weren't seeing before. It is something new imported into the heart of the church. And it is the same old story. It's the same thing that Jeroboam did. Why did he do that? To maintain the political solvency of the north. That's why. Not because there was anything about the religion that God had revealed. He had a political agenda. Why did the Sadducees do what they do? Same thing. It was to maintain this tension between the world and the religious authority. Why do liberal Christians want to do what they do? Because they want to make friends with the world. And that comes at a price. Okay? It also, by the way, comes at a price if you won't make friends with the world, and that's the key thing here. John tells us that there's a price for not making peace with the world. There's a price for making peace with the world as well. All right, let's pray. Lord, you've given us your precious words, and they are life. Teach us to be faithful to those words and faithful to you, and not poison the font of life that you've given to us. Not sacrifice it in order to be friends with the world. But help us, Lord, to be wise as serpents, but innocent as doves, as we bring your saving word to a world that desperately needs it, but doesn't want it. Amen.